Well, welcome everybody. You're in for a treat. Thank you for joining us here at this portion of the Building the Religious Left conference sponsored by the DSA's Religion and Socialism Working Group. My name is Chaz Howard, and I have the great privilege of engaging with someone who I've been he's been a friend in my mind and a friend in my heart for a long time,
Mhm.
and one of these distant mentors. I'm so excited that you get to join me in engaging Mr. Professor George Lakey, and it's really great to connect with you, sir. If I could share a little bit about your story, but I think a part of the conversation will be hearing in your own words your story. Born in Bangor, Pennsylvania, the son of a miner and a graduate of Cheney University. It's an HBCU here in the Philadelphia area, as well as the University of Oslo. He also studied at Penn, the place that we get to share. And your resume is amazing. And I almost don't want to call it a resume. I want to call it sort of spaces that you have entered and movements that you have blessed and have journeyed with and been a fellow sojourner with. The Ban the Bomb movement, Civil Rights movement, Freedom Summer, Quaker Action Group, the anti-Vietnam efforts, including those efforts over in Vietnam, gay liberation, anti-apartheid, movement for a new society, efforts in Puerto Rico, Men Against Patriarchy, Earth Quaker Action Committee, and so much more. And those are just some of the places that you directly have connected. You've mentored folks in a number of other movements. And you've been out there on the street risking arrest, getting arrested, doing that in different places, including most recently connecting with Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Enough. And you've just been there. You've taught at Crozier Theological, at Penn, at Haverford, Swarthmore, Temple, just about every school here in the Philly area. Man, you have blessed, and you have written and taught a great amount around nonviolence and direct action. Sir, it is an honor to engage you. Thank you, and welcome to this conversation.
You're reminding me of Norman Thomas, who, toward the end of his life, when he would be introduced in a similar way, he would say, "There's something about getting to be very old and hearing your obituary early."
No, no, man, not at all, not at
But it
all.
does sound exhausting when you run it down like that.
No, no. Can I ask a question right off the top?
Sure.
Reading that, these are heavy topics, man. This is it's systems of oppression, violence, and hate, and yet everyone who engages you talks about you have this like contagious joy. You have this huge smile, this big like soul laugh. Where does that come from? Like, how do you have joy in the midst of like everything happening out there? Where does that come from?
Well, I was brought up in an evangelical church that was a split off from the Methodist. You've heard of Methodist enthusiasm.
Yeah, there it is.
And I bonded with Jesus as a boy. And so, and what I got, I mean, people get different things from Jesus, right? But one of the things I got was the guy could go to a wedding and have a great time, and be
Mhm.
a party spirit. The guy kept finding um, affirmation around him. And even though he was in the prophetic tradition and woe unto you for this and that, it was also lifting people up and seeing, and that was part of the healing, right? It was lifting
Mhm.
people up. So I identified with that as a boy, and he was clearly a rebel. And so I thought, okay, so you get to be a joyous rebel if you follow Jesus. And so that just struck me as very obvious. I didn't get it why not all the adults got it that way, but that was certainly the way I got
A
it.
joyous rebel.
Yeah.
That's so. Oh man, you bless me. I'm going to be benevolently haunted by that phrase. I hope for the rest of my life, a joyous rebel. One thing you said, different people get different things out of Jesus, though. And I think there's a whole lot of folks on the left who are hesitant around broadly religious matters, but particularly here in the States, matters around faiths like Christianity, because there's some people who've gotten not nice things out of it. And we've seen um, folks on the other side of many of the issues that were sort of invoked earlier when I was reading your bio, also them drawing in their interpretation on religious and Christian sources. What do you say to those of us on the left who are like, look, you seem like a nice guy and all, but the whole religion thing, it's like the cause of so much of the suffering and pain, and I don't want any part of it. And in fact, I don't think it should be in this house. What do you say to that person?
Well, I just walk very carefully with people until I know that it's what it's okay to say. And I usually find some way of referring to it somehow or other. But after there's rapport, first I want to establish connection with people. And that's again an example from Jesus, right? Like look, who couldn't he relate to, right? But he established connection, and then, oh, and by the way, my Father God says this and that, right? And
Mm.
I feel that's important to us. Not that the first words out of our mouth are will be taken as religious and therefore suspect, but more that they get to know us some. We work side by side with them, and then sooner or later the question of motivation comes up, I think, in a natural way. And that's the way I try to handle it.
What was that St. Francis quote? Preach the gospel always, and sometimes use words, something to that effect. And in many ways, I think that
Sometimes actions.
I hear you. It is in these connections, and just by being decent and kind and building trust. And then when someone asks, "What's the source of your passion? Why are you out here?" That's beautiful. Rather than letting it rain tracts and beating people over the head with the Bible. And that, one of the things I've admired about you from afar is your commitment to peace and nonviolence, even in the face of great violence. I think we often sort of feel that the way you stop a violent act or a violent nation is we sort of come with bigger weapons and bigger muscles and kind of make them stop. On the other hand, you have pushed against violent spaces with nonviolence and grace. I have a really good friend of mine who wrestled with the question of the ethics of punching Nazis. And particularly after we've seen examples of what happened in Charlottesville a couple of years ago, kind of a white nationalist march with the tiki torches, and there were white nationalists who were also sort of neo-Nazis in that space. And he wrestled with, and we had several conversations about, is it ever okay to punch a Nazi in the face? I pose the same question to you, because I think a lot of us have this deep hurt and pain and rage when we see folks like that, and we hear some of the things coming out of their mouths about folks we love, and I just feel our little fist balling up here, and I just want to knock that smug smile off their face and shut them up, because I don't like what you're saying, and let me make sure you don't come back to this city. One good jab to the face is going to turn you around, and I bet you won't come back again. What do you say to that, to us who feel that sometimes?
Yeah. Well, I feel the anger, and I've used violence on occasion, never when I wanted to. I mean, never thoughtfully or strategically or in line with what I really thought made sense. But I can be a very, very angry guy, and sometimes let loose. And so I'm not condemnatory toward that impulse, especially when the impulse comes from a righteous place. On the other hand, I do raise the question: what's the outcome? I raise that question. What's the outcome? What's being communicated from us when we do that? And what's the chance that that person will learn something valuable from being smacked in the face? I mean, most people, when they're hit, let's face it, it's additional grievance, and they already have a grievance, which leads them to a Nazi position or white supremacist position, and then adding to their grievance is obviously not the way to teach them anything valuable. So I figure let's operate in a way that works. Now, I was hugely influenced by the civil rights movement because, for one thing, my age. I was young, but an adult when the civil rights movement was happening. My first time arrested was in the civil rights sit-in, and so on. So I was hugely influenced by watching all of that, and I was in the North, so I wasn't facing the worst of it, which was in the Deep South. So what deeply impressed me was how the civil rights movement beat the Ku Klux Klan in the South. In other words, they made specific concrete gains, last week we couldn't eat in this lunch counter because we're Black. This week we can eat in this lunch counter, even though we're right. I mean, what is more concrete than those gains that were gotten? Did they destroy white supremacy? Hardly. But we are talking about states like Alabama and Mississippi that were virtually run by the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council, the somewhat more upper class version. And they and who were they going to go to? Those Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizers, for example, who are they going to go to for protection? Could they get it from local law enforcement? No, local law enforcement was putting on sheets at night. They were the KKK. Well, then would they go to the state and ask for support? No, of course not. The state wanted them dead. Well, would they go to the federal government in Washington, the Kennedy brothers, John and his brother Robert, and ask for assistance? There was no point to it. I mean, they asked, but they knew they weren't going to get it because the Democratic Party did not want to touch them. It would lose the South, which in fact, it eventually touched them and lost the South. So it was entirely because the civil rights movement, there were exceptions, but the civil rights movement in general maintained a nonviolent posture that they were able to make those gains or even to survive at all. I talked with Bob Moses about this because he was the director of Mississippi Summer, right? The Freedom Summer. And he had been surviving for a year and a half, 2 years by the time I got to him in 1964. And I because I was one of the Freedom Summer gang of trainers, and that's how I got to be next to him. So I said, Bob, I want to understand, how are you still alive?
Wow, that's a heavy question to ask, man.
Right. But it was a reasonable question. What chance would you give? What chance would I give for SNCC workers surrounded by people who wanted them dead to survive more than a month, much less a couple of years? And he said, the only reason we've survived is because we don't have guns in our freedom houses and everyone knows it.
Wow.
So, okay, so I'm a pragmatic, sociologist trained person. So I want to understand more. And I said, I'm not seeing the mechanism. Like, how is it that you're not having guns and everybody knowing it protects you? Where's the protection in that? And he said, okay, let me tell you a story about what I think goes on. Let's picture small town, hardware store. The worker goes to work on Monday morning. He says to his boss, the worker happens to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Which the boss knows. The boss happens to be a member of the White Citizens Council, which the employee knows, right? So the employee feels very free to say, guess what, boss, tonight is the night. Tonight's the night we get those, and then he says expletives to describe Black organizers. And the employer looks at him and says, no, you're not going to do that. I'm not going to let you. And the employee says, what's the problem? You know as much as I do, they need to be killed. And the employer looks at him and says, what you don't understand is the bigger economic picture. Mississippi is in trouble economically. We need capital from the North to expand in order to even have much of a future. We will be cut off from finance from the North if it looks like what we're doing is running around shooting up a lot of Black civil rights workers. Wow. It'll look like uproar. Why invest in a place that's full of uproar and killing? He said, no, I won't let you do that. So I said, Bob, let me understand this. So you're using one bunch of racists, White Citizens Council, to control another bunch of racists, the Ku Klux Klan. Bob smiles. That's what we're doing.
I love it. I love it, man.
So in response to your question, I'd like to invite people into strategy analysis. What's your problem? What are the factors that are going on? I mean, that is enormously sophisticated strategy that Bob came up with. He wouldn't have come up with it if he didn't have a prior commitment to nonviolence, because his intention was find a way to make this work. So I must think strategically to figure this out. and he figured it out. More sophisticated than anything I've ever heard from the Pentagon as far as strategy goes, right? I mean, this is smart strategy. Okay, so I ask everybody, look, what will get your brain to kick in strategically so that you can win? What the civil rights movement found, up against way harder challenge than we are facing now, way harder challenge, surrounded by the people who wanted them dead. Yeah. What they found kept them alive and got them concrete victories was a commitment to nonviolence.
As opposed to the catharsis from just throwing a punch.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, man. If I can jump around.
Sure.
I know you've been tracking with some of the voting suppression efforts that different state legislatures are doing around the country. I think most notably, things have been called out in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And then there's been more and more every day at the time of this recording, different businesses trying to put the squeeze on Georgia. So the Major League Baseball All-Star game has been moved out of there, which is taking a significant amount of sort of one day or a couple day business out of there. Delta, Coca-Cola, different spots are sort of doing strategic pressure and economic pressure. Easy. Does that still work? Do you think it's working?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Oh, sure. There are debates. I'm sure there are people arguing right now who are in between or near the white supremacists and so on. Yes, I know that you want to put down black people and keep them from voting, but we need the dollars.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. Andrew Young knew that also, the executive director for years of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was a minister in a Methodist church, or UCC, I guess it was UCC in Georgia, Southwest Georgia. And he also used the economic factor as a way of working against the Ku Klux Klan in his particular part of Georgia. Yeah, why not use the economics of it?
Yeah. It's profound. I mean, I imagining if King and Rosa Parks and other leaders in Montgomery physically tried to change bus segregation and started, jabbing bus drivers and lighting buses on fire and things. I'm trying to imagine how that would have played out compared to, and not easy, and at times very painful, but deeply economically impactful and strategic bus boycott that happens there. And it's fascinating, man. On the other hand, there is hurt and pain. Both of us are in the Philly area here, in Philly proper. And, last summer of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, pre-vaccine, the story of the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, and then very locally, the killing of Walter Wallace Jr. here in Philadelphia, led a whole lot of us to the streets, in City Hall, on 52nd Street in West Philadelphia, in other spots around sort of Northeast. And my daughter, my teenage daughters were a part of those folks out there. I wish I could have gotten you on the phone to get in her ear to say, before you go out there, young lady, let me coach you a little bit. What would you have said to her? And what will you say looking ahead, sadly, if and when we need to sort of take to the streets again in response to violence against particularly Black bodies by law enforcement individuals? What coaching would you give before you go out there? What do you say?
Well, now that we're here, we can learn from the Black Lives Matter's insurgency that followed the Floyd Moore, the George Floyd murder. And we can see what actually happened, which is that at first there was the kind of rioting and burning of buildings, building of stores. For us in West Philly, we had the spectacle of Black people's stores being burned and looted, which was, Black Lives Matters, so let's burn Black people's stores. Come on. I had people in my kitchen because most of the people in my household are Black, and they were around the kitchen table. You should have heard their fury that people were doing what they were doing on 52nd Street. So that's part of it. Like there's such a thing as allowing your rage instead of strategy end up doing your own people ill, right?
Yeah.
But the thing was that stuff didn't last very long. And then the movement, the insurgency around the country, overwhelmingly peaceful, right?
True.
And that's what moved things. And next thing you know, we did see NASCAR of all. That's right. And NFL, whoever thought NFL would ever see the light, right? And so on. And they were all seeing the light because of if things had remained in the burning storefronts level, do you think there would have been all of that happened?
No, sir.
Do you think that white people, majority white people in small towns in Pennsylvania or Kansas would have come out on the streets and said Black Lives Matter? Would they have done that and associated themselves with a rioting operation? Of course not. So I think we learn already from just this experience. If we don't know anything else about other struggles in the world, we can see in our own recent experience what pays off is not the initial rioting, which we're still paying the price for, but instead what pays off is the peaceful protest.
If I can zoom in a little bit even further, though, she and to be quite frankly, me too, had enough pain that I could have lit something on fire. I could have thrown something through a window, particularly anger aimed at police officers, and qualify all that by saying super complicated field and a hard job, but so much pain out of being stopped at every city I've lived in as a kid and as an adult that I could have tagged something on the side of a cop car. What do you say about that inclination of I'm that angry right now, and it needs to go somewhere, and I want to break that car window right now?
We need to take full responsibility for our own emotional beings.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
Full responsibility for our own emotional beings. Dr. King and his colleagues, after one of those demonstrations with, watching their friends being clubbed to the ground and so on, would go back to the motel and have a pillow fight.
That's wow.
And hit each other as hard as they could with pillows until they were screaming and crying, because they were ventilating, they were catharting, and that's necessary. We need to understand our own emotional makeup enough to understand we need to take responsibility for that. We can't just vent because we feel like venting. Is that what we think when teachers are annoyed with students? And tell me, do teachers get annoyed with students?
Better
Would
preach.
say, oh, you're annoyed. Well, that gives you a blank check to hit the students.
No.
Right? I mean, that 8th grader, totally infuriating, right? Go ahead, hit him. We don't say that. We say, take responsibility for your own emotional makeup, for what's going on. Don't suppress it.
Yeah.
I mean, suppress it for the moment, control yourself. But then when you have that moment, take it and do the catharsis work that you need to do. Think of the the storefronts. Talk about catharsis work going on. In that church tradition, right?
Come on.
Think of the crying and carrying on that goes on there. I'm part of that. I was brought up an evangelical, right? I've been to revival services with tears flowing down my face, and tears flow down my face today because I'm still crying, because there's still plenty to cry about. I still vent and rage. Sometimes I do it when I speak a little more than I should at bookstores and stuff, and the bookstore manager says, time to sell books. Because I'm furious a lot of the time. I am furious a lot of the time. That's okay. I follow an angry Jesus.
Woo. Come on, Doc.
And he didn't run around he didn't run around blowing things up or hitting people.
No.
But there's no question about whether he was angry.
Yeah.
I love the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Pasolini's film shows him as this angry young rebel who is really telling it as it is. He knew more clearly than you and I do what evil is lurking in the hearts of people around him that he saw oppressing people, including Rome. And so he had to deal with that too. He had to take responsibility for his emotional being. And that's what we need to do. And that's the value of training. As you know, I've made a tremendous lot of my life about training people to be out there and do the right thing. Because just like the Army, I mean, the Army wouldn't say to its soldiers, hey, look, you get out there, and if you get angry, go ahead. Don't wait for an order. Just charge up that mountain. Don't wait for an order. Just go ahead, go with your feeling, go with your gut. I mean, what commander would say that? The Army knows training is necessary to do effective combat. That is the same case for nonviolent combat. Nonviolent combat requires training, and that's why the Civil Rights Movement was so successful in the South. It really believed in training. I was part of that, and I've been training ever since.
I love it, man. What a word. When I've had this conversation with some of my students on campus, one of the legit pushbacks they say is, why are you talking about us and our potential violence when you should be talking to them, pointing at police officers and their violence?
We can control our behavior. We can't control theirs.
What advice would you give to cops? What in this regard around broadly violence and engaging others? Because so many young activists right now are like, we are not the problem. We wouldn't be out here if it weren't for violence against Black bodies and lack of accountability and others. What advice would you give police leadership, street officers walking beats, criminal justice? I mean, that's a huge question, but if you had a big audience of law enforcement officers, what would you say?
I would talk about living in Norway, where I have lived, where there are no guns on police officers.
Yes.
I would talk about Britain, where I've lived, where you don't see guns on police officers.
Yes.
The whole idea that we should be arming police officers with lethal force strikes me as crazy. It's the Wild West, still going on. The sheriff, right? Dodge City or something like that.
Yeah.
Sweden, no, they think you're crazy if you wanted police to walk around with guns. Denmark, no way. Iceland, are you kidding? So it is possible for human beings to take care of business without armed police officers running around. And our police are out of control. There's no question about that. But we need what we need once we get people's attention, which we got through Black Lives Matters, people actually thinking about, oh, police, how about that? Then we need to have a vision of what the alternative is, because BLM had people's ear. I think still has people's ear. Has people's ear. Okay, if you don't do that, then what do you do? And that's great. To get this country's ear is an amazingly luscious opportunity, right? So that's when you have a vision, a blueprint, how to do community safety without police. Defunding police is like saying, well, end sin or something. I mean, it's just, there's nothing specific to it. And majorities of Black people don't want to defund the police because they know if there's nothing at all, then it's better to have police than nothing at all. So we need the alternative. The alternative work needs to be done. And the great thing about our country is we've got plenty of intellectual resources to do exactly that. Plus, we've got examples, we've got models in Europe where people disarmed the police. At one point, they were armed and they said, this is ridiculous. And they disarmed the police.
Yes, sir.
And increased, by the way, community safety. That was their track record. Yes.
And that's the goal. I so appreciate when activists, when folks on the left speak of defunding the police, speak of abolishing prisons, and then have a lot more to say after that. And then have a lot more to say and cast a vision.
The conversation, not the closer. Right?
Absolutely. Slogans are important, symbols are important, but so are detailed plans and strategy of getting there. I hear that. Can I ask a personal question?
Sure.
How do you embody this? And I'll frame it this way. I see so many folks, particularly those who kind of move in academic spaces, who we describe ourselves as leftist, we describe ourselves as progressive, we speak of nonviolence and we write about it, and we critique institutions like capitalism and law enforcement and criminal justice system. and broadly sexism and homophobia and religious bigotry. And yet we also are complicated humans who have like retirement funds with major investment banks and investment firms, and might be huge carnivores and kind of eat a lot of meat and drive a big Suburban that is gas. Like, how do you wrestle with living it day by day, not just kind of when they need us on the front line, not just when we're writing about it, but in kind of living it day by day? What is, can I ask, what does that look like for you and people in your orbit?
Maybe this is because of an academic bias towards sociology, but I look for collective solutions. That is, I take the pressure off me to figure out how to live the ideal lifestyle by myself. And I'm very interested in teaming up with other people to create, because I think we can go way farther as a group, whether that's a group of 6 or 10, or whether it's a congregation. Like, it's very important that I'm a Quaker to me, because Quakers tend to be very idealistic and visionary and are willing to throw in together. And what I found when I started an intentional community that lasted for almost 20 years in West Philadelphia, in which we lived communally. And we had 8, 10 in my house. We had 10 people. No, we had 12 people for a while. And what we found was, in every case, the aspirations that we had to clean up our individual lives were more easily realized through group solutions than they could be through individual solutions. So that's one of the places where class analysis, let's hear it for class analysis.
All right, let's go.
Where class analysis really, really is helpful, right? Because if we do a class analysis of how people's minds tend to work in our country, we'll notice that people trained up as children to be middle class, especially professional middle class, upper middle class, tend to be very individualistic.
Wow.
And then bring that individualism into their social change work. So I had the great good fortune of being brought up blue collar, and I don't have much expectation about being able to solve all this as an individual, because I never heard that in my upbringing. It was always together. The community, we can figure this stuff out. And that's, I think, therefore, one of the things that we can do as we're building the movements that need to be strong enough to throw out the economic elite and replace it with, replace the structure, the capitalism, with something much better. That as we build those movements, we need to build movements that build in the unlearning of individualism and the new learning of trusting each other to look out for each other and find solutions, concrete behavioral solutions, like shared childcare and so on and so on. Just all those different kinds of things that can be done that lighten individual loads and at the same time make a higher level of realization of our ideals possible.
Well said. Well said. The things you don't talk about in public are like religion and politics, but we're kind of going there for a little bit.
I guess we are.
How did you land in the Society of Friends? How did you land in Quakerism?
I wandered in one day because I was doing the rounds in my college town of all the different religions. I thought, this is an opportunity, right? So I was going to all the different ones. How do the Methodists do? What do the Presbyterians do? What's Catholic Mass like? And so I wandered into Quakers because that was on my list. And I thought, oh my goodness. Whoa, there's something so unpretentious about waiting in silence for God to speak to us. It was like drop the whatever, and just let God talk.
Come on.
Give it whatever. I want to say him because I was brought up that way, but you know what I mean. Give Spirit the chance to take charge. How much do you listen? And I was just deeply, deeply moved by that.
I've heard people describe Quakerism as in many ways a spiritual manifestation of sort of radical democracy or socialism, in that one sense a lot of the hierarchy it looks very different, is really broken down than many other sects or denominations. And there really is, in many ways, a physical circle that's formed in some sort of Quaker meetings. But this sort of, we are in this together. We are not waiting for a top-down word to come down. We are sharing of the Spirit, and the Spirit has access to all of us and through all of us. And there's something beautifully, democratic doesn't capture the depths of it, but it really does feel like we all are here. There's something really beautiful about that. Do you see your Quakerism as feeding your politics and your justice work?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Partly because it started in a revolutionary movement in England in the 17th century, when there were levelers and diggers,
Yeah, man. Yeah.
all kinds of, right? It was all about revolution, right? And Quakers came along as steeped in that, and saying, and in addition to all that earthly stuff that needs a big shakeup, we need to make room for the divine.
Yes.
So they were bringing a kind of religious impulse to the revolutionary assembly of various tendencies and so on. And so things like abolition of slavery and all that sort of thing came just kind of automatically came to them as abolishing war and so on. Just
Yep.
all seemed like part of what God's will was for us. It wasn't God's idea that we should be so nasty to each other. So, so let's do it, but we'll have to do it through movements. And so the Quaker movement was very much that, a movement. I wouldn't say it's a movement now, it's much more like a church, in the sense of much more institutionalized, but still, because of not, for most Quakers, not having stated paid ministry, not having a paid ministry.
Right.
What it's meant is less bureaucracy and more emphasis on the community and the Spirit.
Oh, man, I imagine many listeners or viewers might be visiting a Quaker meeting or two this weekend after they well. May I ask one more question?
Sure.
What do you love, and where do you see love on the left? It's a word that I think doesn't seem to always fit when we talk about radical politics, when we talk about sort of movements for change. I think in some people's minds, it's often fueled by a righteous indignation, by a resistance, by a frustration, by a hurt and a pain, by fighting back. But we don't often always hear about love. Where does love come into all this for you? What do you love, and where do you see it?
Love is central. And yes, plenty of indignation is there, but love is central. And yeah, love is, I don't know, it's like oxygen. It's fundamental. I have some trouble loving myself sometimes. So that I think goes along with being blue collar. We're told other people are better than we are. And so there can be a kind of shame attached to that. And so sometimes I have to remember, George, you're into shining the light of love around you, and so on and so on. And how about shine that into the mirror so it comes right back on you. And I always, of course, do much better work, much better activism, much better writing, and much better loving when I do that.
Well, I love you, brother, and I'm so grateful for your spirit, and I love the great service you have provided to so many people over the years. I love everything you've written, and if anyone's watching or listening to this, I commend to you, please look up Brother George's books and read them all, and articles, and find every podcast that make this your summer project, journeying with someone who I think embodies love. And while we're handing out love, we got to give love to the Religion and Socialism Working Group of the DSA, and Brother Fran and Sister Maxine, and everybody who's played a part in making this exciting conference happen. Brother, thank you so much for taking time, man. I am grateful. I look forward to going for a walk on Kelly Drive with you when things open up again.
Oh yeah, let's do that.
You already know. It's going to be great.
Let's do that, brother. Thank
Everyone, thanks so much for coming. Take care.
you.